Sadia, and I will be chairing this event. So you'll be hearing from a few of us. We're waiting for one more person, but we're going to get started just so we can let all of our frustrations out about the bus as soon as possible. So this event is organized by Action Kiel, and we are a campaign of the Socialist Project. The SP is a Toronto-based organization that is committed to the development of a more free, democratic, humane, sustainable society than the one that we live in. We are convinced that only through understanding the struggles around us at a system-wide level of capitalism can we build a society that works for all of us and not just for the wealthy few. Action Kiel, which you'll be hearing more about, is our attempt to develop the idea that while big problems are system-wide, we experience our lives at the level of home, neighborhood, workplace, and yes, bus route. So we want to connect these two levels. I have a couple of questions. How many of you to come here today took the bus? Oh wow, a majority. Okay. How many of you had a great experience taking the bus? That's good. So a minority of us had a good experience. How many of you avoided taking the bus fearing that it would make you late? A few of us. So another couple of questions. How many people live along the Kiel route from here? So around in this neighborhood. Yeah. Okay. So a lot of us end up making that calculation on a daily basis that we're like, do we want to take the bus or not? But some of us have no choice but to be at the mercy of the TTC. We can't afford a car or other ways of getting around. Others of us have invested in a car after assessing that the way our lives are and the way public transit is running right now is just not working together. And some of us, when we're waiting for the bus, it's taking a long time, we think it's going to make us like 20, 30 minutes late for work. Sometimes we're just like, let's just catch a cab and like waste much more money just so we get to work on time. So the question for us is, what could our lives and our finances be like under a free, high-quality public transit system that seamlessly connected all parts of our lives? Okay? What kind of possibilities would that open up to us? So today you will hear from our speakers both about the problems of living and using transit in the inner suburbs, that is outside of the downtown area, as well as about efforts by community members and riders to demand a better public transit system. So you will hear lots of anger. We want to hear you guys' frustrations. I already heard some great ideas about potential campaigns. So we also want to make this a way to brainstorm about doing something and not just voicing our angers. Okay. Yeah. So I'll let Vincent introduce himself.
Sure, fantastic. So my name is Vincent, as you've heard. So I'm with a group you may have heard of called TTC Riders. Before I launch into a little bit about what TTC Riders does as a grassroots transit organization, I want to give you a little bit of insight into sort of where I come from, how I've got involved in that movement. I think it does mirror the lives of a lot of people who did grow up in the inner suburbs. I grew up in eastern Scarborough, actually. So if anyone knows Scarborough at all, my house was just way at the end of Morningside Avenue where it hits the lake. So almost as far east as you can go before you hit Pickering. So the suburbs, as deep, as far as you can go. So my family wasn't very rich. We did own our own home, but I think they were a little bit cash poor from that. So some of my earliest memories are taking the bus with my mom and dad to go do various errands, in the summer to go down to the exhibition, this sort of a thing. So it wasn't the suburban life where your parents shuttle you to and from the mall. We were on the bus, we were walking places, and that was, like I said, some of my earliest memories were on the bus. When I was older, I actually went to York University, so I have lived experience with the Kiel bus and the crappiness that it involves. So while at York, I studied history and political science, where I guess I kind of got into this sort of activist mindset from other students and instructors, and I think just being fed up with the way things were. So for me, choosing to take transit was something that I wanted to do, and it's always been a frustration. Even I guess, so far back that I couldn't even realize that I was thinking this, the frustration that transit isn't better. I don't want to have to drive to go everywhere. I don't want to have to pay to take a cab to go to work, which is a reality for so many people, including myself, when you're running late. I want a good transit system. That should be a choice that people have. And it should give dignity to those who are riding it. So this is a sort of a frustration that I have. I didn't really know how to express it, right? Because when you're standing waiting for the bus in a freezing cold winter day, you feel very alone. You think, well, no one else is dealing with this. All my friends, well, there wasn't Uber back then, all my friends are Ubering everywhere or whatnot. You feel very alone. You feel that you're not part of anything bigger. I think this is a situation mirrored by a lot of transit riders, different from myself. Perhaps those who can't afford to drive, perhaps those who are working in jobs that are low wage, odd hours. These are the type of people who are taking public transit. I was working low wage and weird hours, also taking transit. So you feel very alone, very disconnected. So during that time period, I guess I'd say this is back in 2013, I came across TTC Riders. So TTC Riders was formed, probably it was 2012, Herman, if you can correct me on that. Maybe 2011, 2012 was the genesis of TTC Riders as a distinct organization. And the mandate of our group is to be a grassroots voice for transit riders. So I discovered, I believe through a Google search, to be honest, when feeling quite frustrated, see if anyone else who felt the same way as me. But since then I've been involved with this organization, and we have a number of campaigns, but I want to go into some of the more long-term work that TTC Riders has done. We're trying to mobilize transit riders as a coherent group, as a distinct constituency. Because when you hear about a lot of campaigns, it tends to be about very specific issues. You know, poverty, housing, justice for workers making minimum wage. But transit cuts across all of these issues. So what we're trying to do in the big sense is mobilize transit riders to fight for a transit system that gives them dignity and that connects the city and connects their lives. So as part of that, our two long-standing campaigns are for better service and lower fares. So you might notice that's pretty wide. That can mean a lot of things. But the point behind that is really to identify the pain points that people suffer when riding the TTC. So as we know, fares keep going up and up every year. We know that service is either stagnant or decreasing. Am I talking loud enough?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So service is either stagnant or decreasing, and fares keep going up and up. So not only is it hitting you where you can least afford it, it's hitting you in your ability to get to work on time, to get to the hospital, go see your friend, do all the things that people who aren't taking transit just take for granted, right? I'm seeing a lot of people nodding that these are pain points. So I guess what does that look like in practice? Because it's one thing to say up front that you're going to mobilize transit riders, but what does that actually mean? So I'll give you an example. So every year around actually both levels of government, the provincial government and the municipal government budget process. Now typically members of provincial parliament and the city will try and have these consultations about what people want to see from the budget. We think that's not good enough. So what we've done year after year, I guess I'll use this past year as an example. So back in February, before the budget process began, we fanned out across the city groups of 3-4 people at different subway stops and bus stops to spend a good 2-3 hours in the morning talking to transit riders and a good 1 or 2 hours in the evening, afternoon talking to transit riders. What we found is so many riders are so disconnected from the decisions that affect their travel. They're so disconnected from other riders and so beaten down by this experience that people don't even realize that A, there's a budget process going on, B, who funds the TTC, and C, how to actually make it better, right? So we have those conversations with individual riders about the need for, lower fares, the need for better service on their routes, try and connect with them about their specific pain points and go forward that way. One of the goals we've had is trying to have them call their city councillors and MPPs. Because again, these politicians probably don't ride transit themselves. I say probably, it's highly likely.
Maybe.
Right, exactly. So who are they going to be hearing from? Who are they going to be hearing from the most? the people who have time to complain, people who have time to go to a public meeting. So they're going to hear from the people who complain about their minivan, they don't know where to park, this kind of thing, right? I want my taxes low. That's all they hear. So we need them to hear from transit riders. So not only do we have conversations with riders at the bus stops, at the subway stops, the aim is to have them realize that you can actually control your fate to some extent. You can reach out to your elected officials and let them know how you feel. So that's been a long-standing campaign, but it has to go beyond that as well. Because it's one thing to have people, I guess, act as a supplicant to their elected officials. Please help me. Please, my bus is late all the time. Please, fares are expensive. It's quite another thing to build a movement that can displace these individuals, if you will, in the public consciousness. So, surrounding election times, we do the same thing. Transit riders are potentially a major constituency that are not being activated. So we will reach out in the same manner, in a grassroots manner, low-income housing areas, bus stops, subway stops. Tell people these are the issues that are affecting you. You're not alone. We're with you. Phone your city councillor. Get involved in the campaign. So that's a little bit of a nutshell of what it looks like. Now, I would welcome questions to sort of focus my talk. I guess once we're done, we're going to go into a free-for-all, because I'd love to talk more in specificity about what we do. But that's a bit of an outline about TTC Riders. It's a bit of an outline about our fight for better transit. I do want to close off by linking it to the Keel, Action Keel campaign. So as part of our organization, we do have a committee, if you will, to support the King Street pilot. So if anyone's unaware, this is the project that was unveiled by the city downtown on the King streetcar that gave the streetcar priority over motor traffic. So it's impossible now to drive straight through an intersection on Keel Street between, I think it's Parliament and Bathurst. Only the streetcars can go through and cyclists. So motorists have to turn right. So it gives the transit actual priority. So we formed this committee because of the pushback against giving some sort of a dignity to transit riders, giving priority to transit. One of the reasons why the King Street pilot is so important is because it gives a template of how to improve transit in the inner suburbs. So as I said, I grew up in Scarborough, and I can't count the number of times where a bus full of 70 people is stuck behind a line of 4 or 5 cars turning right on the road. So not only do we have to pay a lot of money to ride the TTC, we're late because we're stuck in traffic. Because the transit, which is carrying more people, has no priority.
That's right.
Right? Exactly. Look outside right now. Roads are 6 lanes wide. So
Yeah.
who has priority? The bus full of 70 people? No. The minivan, 1 person in it.
Yeah.
So the King Street pilot offers a template to expand this across the city. So when I was looking at the Keel bus, I see, as a transit rider, I see 2 problems. Frequency is poor. This is a problem that's across the entire inner suburbs of Toronto. Frequency is poor. And there's no transit priority. So the vehicles are stuck in traffic, they're full, people have been waiting, and it's a bad experience. It drives people away. And for those who are stuck on transit, they're not going anywhere, they're late. It's horrific. So, like I say, the reason we're pushing for this King Street pilot is that it can be replicated across the entire city. That hasn't really been part of the political discussion so far. That's why it's up to us as transit riders, as people who care about working class and the working poor, and those who ride transit, to advance this idea in our conversation with each other, in our conversations with the candidate at the door, and beyond that, as we move beyond just elections into actual long-term organizing to improve transit, because it's one of the quickest ways that we can improve people's lives as they ride these buses. So that's what I'm going to finish off with. I guess there's some hope that we can push for these transit priorities and more frequency on routes like Keel. And I encourage you to come talk to me once we're done, or talk to me during the free-for-all that we're going to have, because there's more ideas out there that I want to hear. There's ideas that maybe we can learn from each other, and more importantly, I want you guys to be involved. Right? So come talk to me. We'll have a free-for-all. It's going to be great, and I guess I'll leave it on to my other panelists here.
Thank you. So maybe we can move on to Jonah now?
Sure.
Yeah. And introduce yourself.
Awesome.
Thanks. So my name is Jonah Gindin, and I'm here representing an organization called RadTO. RadTO is kind of a new group that started, and it's primarily intended to be kind of a network, bringing together different organizations from across the city that are doing organizing on specific issues or in specific neighborhoods. So I'll just kind of give a little bit of a background on how we formed and why we formed and what we're doing, what our goals are, and what we're currently engaged in. We are mostly made up of people who've been doing different kinds of organizing in the city for many years, anti-poverty organizing, anti-racist organizing, solidarity work with different communities, and one of the things that we kind of had always experienced in the work that we're doing is that if you're working on, transit affordability or transit access, if you're working on housing issues, if you're working on anti-poverty work, anti-racism, you tend to work with a small number of other groups working on those issues, and there's not a ton of overlap with other groups that are working on, in theory, separate issues, even though at the same time there's obviously so much overlap between all these things. As we know, obviously there's a relationship between racism and poverty. Many communities that suffer racism also partially as a result are more likely to experience poverty. Similarly, there's an overlap between communities who are struggling with an affordability crisis in terms of housing and also access to transit. And so we came together, people who had been working on these different issues, and identified kind of one of the major gaps in the city in terms of our assessment of how we could move forward and make some progress on some of these issues, was that everybody was fragmented and kind of in their silos working on their separate things. And we had the feeling that there was a moment that we might be able to capitalize on where there is, the moment has since changed slightly. There's a little bit more of a rise of fascism happening now, but a year ago when we started, people were a little bit more feeling a little bit optimistic, a little bit hopeful about the positive experiences and the support that radical left-wing candidates like Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn, Bernie Sanders in the US, Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, had experienced in terms of speaking openly about socialism, openly about anti-poverty, about free tuition, about charging the banks, not working people, and so we thought that this might be a moment to try and capitalize on that energy and that experience to specifically intervene in an election about the idea of bringing together these different struggles and trying to articulate a vision for Toronto that incorporates affordable housing, that incorporates accessible, affordable transit, that incorporates all these different things that otherwise were being articulated separately by different groups. So that was kind of our goal. And when we were thinking about it, we didn't, our intention wasn't to take people away from the work that they're doing on their particular issues, but instead to try and expand their capacity by linking these things so that if you're an individual who's feeling frustrated by multiple different problems in the city, you might find it hard to dedicate yourself to say, like, the tiny little bit of time that I have maybe to go to a meeting or to help canvass or something like that. I'm going to do it on one issue but not the other. We wanted to provide a forum that people could say, I want affordable housing and I need transit, and I need to deal with the racist police, issues of racism in policing. So our hope was to articulate a kind of a platform or a vision that includes all of these different issues that would then also make it easier for people to volunteer, to join up, and to dedicate their time to some initiative that kind of is going to fight on all of these different fronts at the same time. So we started by just primarily reaching out to these different organizations and saying, look, we think the work that you're doing in Jane Finch on anti-poverty work is really important. We think the work that you're doing in Parkdale is really important on housing issues, et cetera. And would you be interested in joining forces with these other groups and articulating kind of a common vision? And so over the last year, we've had different meetings and we got endorsements and kind of interest from different groups. So that we've now got to the point that we've developed a platform that reflects the organizing that these different groups are already doing, the kind of politics that they already represent in their particular neighborhood or on their particular issue, and then it brings it all together. And so we just launched that platform this past week. We have a website. I'm sorry that I don't have any paper to give out to anybody, but the website is citywefightfor.org, and you can check it out. So the idea at this point is to intervene in this moment while there is an election happening, and we understand that while there might be some really progressive candidates in certain wards, and maybe even some of them might win, there's even a very progressive candidate for mayor, Saron Gabriselassie. She's unlikely to win, but it's great that she's running and articulating these ideas. We're not actually endorsing a candidate at this point, but what we are trying to do is the election is a time when there are conversations happening that just don't happen the rest of the time. There are issues that people talk about. Suddenly, everybody right now is talking about the affordability crisis and transit in a way that I think after the election we'll see the interest in the media and in the sort of establishment will go down in talking about those issues. Obviously, the context right now in Toronto is we're not having the election in a vacuum. The Ford's attack on Toronto has also, I think, really reinforced the fact that whatever arena in which you're kind of operating, they're all related, and they're particularly related when the sort of elites who kind of have the power and have the control, when they want them to be related. When they don't want them to, they say, oh no, that's separate jurisdiction, that's municipal, that's provincial. And so our goal is to say, look, we live in Toronto. We are trying to talk to our neighbors and talk to people who live in Toronto about particular issues. They may be issues that are currently being decided or primarily being affected by the city or by provincial or by federal government. And we're not really worried too much about the jurisdictional differences. But what we are concerned with is that in general, on these issues, there's not enough people who are actively engaged in knocking on doors and talking to their neighbors and building strong movements, social movements that can actually challenge Ford and Tory, if it is Tory. Hopefully it'll be Keesmaat, but she'll still need to be challenged on many of these issues. So our goal is really on trying to build the capacity of existing organizations, draw in people who haven't already been sort of recruited or tapped by these existing organizations that exist in different parts of the city working on different issues, ultimately with the goal of having committees in different neighborhoods that are filled with new people who haven't previously been engaged in this kind of politics, in opposition to the cuts that are coming from Ford, in opposition to cuts that come at the city level, and for a positive vision of what we're actually trying to achieve in the city. And it's something that the last thing maybe that I'll say is just that it's something that's informed by the experience that many of us had during the first Rob Ford budget in the city of Toronto in 2011. When we had a coalition called, or a network called Stop the Cuts. And Stop the Cuts was, again, a thing that kind of brought together different groups, but that also inspired the creation of a whole bunch of different neighborhood committees. I think at the height there was about 13 different neighborhood committees in different parts of the city that were primarily filled with and led by people who had not previously been very politically engaged. And that experience was short-lived because it was in response to a very particular crisis, and we were all super kind of burnt out, but at the same time, it was a positive experience because it did expand, that sort of base of who the people were that were involved, and that's something that we're trying to be a little more deliberate about trying to build this time, and hope that it has a longer term, that it lasts longer.
Thank you, Jonah.